You're listening to the Eric and Tom Show, featuring Tom and Eric, better known as the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Thank you for tuning in to the 63rd episode of the Paperback Warrior Podcast. My name is Eric, and we're a vintage paperback discussion show focusing on genre fiction from the mid-20th century. The podcast is an outgrowth of our wildly successful blog at paperbackwarrior.com, where you can read new reviews of old books almost every single day, with an archive stretching back for years and years. So let me introduce my broadcast partner, Tom, to talk about what's happening on the show this week.
Thank you, Eric. Today's feature is about a prolific author of paperback originals from the 1950s and onward. His name was Orrie Hitt. His work was marketed by publishers as sleaze fiction, but as we will learn, that description really doesn't do his work justice. My showcase review for the week is an Orrie Hitt novel from 1962 called Dial M for Man. Eric, what are you reviewing this week?
Well, gosh, last week I did a 1956 review, and I called that an oldie, but this week I'm going to be doing a 1948 paperback called Gift of Death by Edward S. Ahrens. So really going back.
Okay, cool. I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about that one.
You took a road trip recently, and you found a used bookstore.
Yes, I did, Eric. And you live in Florida. I live in Florida. Have you ever heard of Chiefland, Florida?
I have never heard of that.
Yeah, I've never heard of it either. But the other day, my employer assigned me to go to Chiefland, Florida, to meet with a guy, and it was an evening meeting. So I looked up Chiefland, and I saw that it's 2.5 hours, about 100 miles from us here in Jacksonville. It's a landlocked town about an hour southwest of Gainesville and a couple hours northeast, I guess, of Tampa. Basically, it's in the middle of nowhere. Now, Chiefland has a population of 2,200 people. The town calls itself the Gem of the Swanee Valley. The main industry there is farming, and there's a state park about 6 miles west of town called Manatee Springs State Park with crystal clear water, 72 degrees, where you can swim with manatees year-round and go camping. Now, Eric, you've been here a while in Florida. Have you ever seen manatees in the wild?
I haven't, but my wife has, and she loves them, and she's begging for us to go swimming with them.
Now, for the sake of listeners, if you're not familiar with the manatee, it's worth your time to Google it. It's basically what you would get if you mated a hippopotamus and a dolphin. Yeah. My family's been down to Crystal River, Florida, to go kayaking with the manatees, and my kids actually got their scuba certifications there among the manatees, and they're kind of amazing creatures. It's worth your time. Take your family. But listen, if manatees, Eric, are not enough to get you to visit Chiefland, maybe this will. Chiefland has the only quilt museum in the entire state of Florida. Now buckle in. The exhibit includes a necktie quilt made completely with ties from former U.S. Presidents Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford, along with 30 U.S. governors who were in office during the early 1990s when this quilt was made. The entire museum is staffed by volunteers, Eric, who are quilters and longtime residents of the area. How does that sound, Eric?
I mean, are there other things there at the museum, like how to quilt or the special classes or something like that?
Well, it's more than just one quilt. The showcase one is the necktie quilt. Listen, I know you and I are both married men, but if we can get a pass from our wives, I suspect that the quilting museum may be a sure thing as far as meeting some women while we're on our boys-only road trip.
I guess what happens at the Chiefland Quilting Museum stays at the Chiefland Quilting Museum.
Indeed. We should go during the week to avoid the bachelor parties they probably host on the weekends.
I'm praying to God that you are knitting together Chiefland with some kind of grand shopping experience.
Yes, okay, so I am getting there. Okay, so when I get this assignment to travel there, I Google used bookstore Chiefland, Florida, and what pops up was something called Etcetera's Jolene's Books and More. But there were no reviews, and the street address came back to a local flea market, so I wasn't hopeful, but there was a phone number. So I called this lady Jolene on her cell phone, as it turned out. She answers. I introduce myself, and I tell her I was visiting her town and wanted to know if she had a bookstore. Now, Jolene was super nice and said that she sets up every weekend at the local flea market selling stuff, including books, and wanted to know exactly what I was looking for. And when you call an alleged bookseller and they ask you to describe what you're looking for, what do you say?
I normally say I'm searching for old paperbacks from 1940s through the 1960s, and I tell them stuff that they may recognize, like old books that have the gold medal on the cover, or old books that have a different book on the other side upside down. And sometimes if they don't seem to have those kind of books, I'll resort to just saying like Mac Bolan or Westerns just to kind of drill down a little bit further for them.
No, you do a pretty good job with that. I always say that I'm looking for old paperbacks from the 1950s and 1960s. And I always say crime novels, spy stuff, those thin 200-page books with the nice painted covers. That usually kind of locks them in on what we're talking about.
That's a good idea.
Anyway, so Jolene knew exactly what I was talking about. She said that she's also looking to acquire those types of books for her flea market table, but she didn't have any now. I asked her, I said, do you know of any used bookstores in the area that may carry stuff like that? And she said there's a used bookstore on Main Street in Chiefland that has a ton of paperbacks, just like what I'm describing. I asked her if she could tell me the name of it or anything about it, and she didn't know. I said, hey, listen, if you be nice, Jolene, you got my cell phone number. It's in your caller ID. Can you do some homework and just text me the name of the store and anything I could use as a lead to actually find this place? And so my problem is, though, Eric, and you've probably been down this road, is I was going to Chiefland on a Monday. And Mondays are the worst day of the week to go book shopping with the vast majority of used bookstores because they just close on Mondays. Now, and I know that if I could reach the owner on the phone and convince her that I am a very big deal, I can make an appointment to get a private showing of the store's inventory. Now, you and I have actually done that before with closed stores. But first I need to figure out how to reach the proprietor. So Jolene promised to text me. I was turning on the charm on the phone, and sure enough, she did. A few hours later, she sent me a message with the name of the bookstore, the address, and the phone number. And the name of the place was Neverending Story. And I did a Google Street View of the building. It's a tiny house on the main street in Chiefland. The house in the picture was covered in leaves and like wild growth from the overhanging trees, and there are vines all over the house. The owner had taken some of those adhesive letters you get at the hardware store and written Western Books, SUSP, S-U-S-P, I imagine that's suspense, bookstore, romance, mystery, bookstore. I'll post a photo of the building on the Paperback Warrior Facebook group, comments underneath this episode so listeners can see it. You saw the building online. I showed that to you. What were your thoughts? Would you be hopeful that you'd find good stuff, or do you think you'd be walking into a nightmare with that photo that I showed you?
Historically, and I'll tell you, man, historically, if the bookstore looks modern and it looks up to date, or if it looks real, touristy with a bunch of mugs or cats in the window, you're probably going to strike out with the books that we're trying to get. But and honestly, I hate those kind of stores. When I'm shopping in a town or a city that's kind of unknown to me, Tom, I always go to the bad part of town with the ugliest, dirtiest building in town that says books anywhere in the store's title. And that's typically where all the good stuff is at. So your picture there isn't especially dirty, but it isn't a real cutesy, quaint little bookshop either. So,
I agree.
So I would be hopeful.
I've been to enough places just like this one that I knew they were going to have good stuff. Question is, how much garbage am I going to have to wade through to get to the good stuff? Because a lot of used bookstores are basically just hoarder houses. Anyway, so I called Neverending Story on Friday around noon, and a nice lady answered. She said her name was Becky, and I asked her if the store was open on Mondays. And she said that they would be open from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. on Monday. I told her I was coming down from Jacksonville, and I'd see her Monday, and she said cool, and so we had a deal. So Monday rolls around, I hit the road around 9:15 in the morning, and I get to Neverending Story around noon, and they were open. I parallel parked right in front of the store and went inside.
So how was it?
So right by the door, sitting at a desk, was an attractive woman named Becky, a very nice lady, and I introduced myself as the guy from Jacksonville who called on Friday and asked her where her mystery and suspense sections were, because I always start there. And she walks me to a room in the back, and the rooms were small in the house, but not cluttered at all. There were floor-to-ceiling books in every room, organized by genre and author's last name. There were some double stacking of books in front of books, which I generally disapprove of. But Becky had taken some real care to make sure that the double stacks were covering up only the same author in the front and back, if that makes sense. So that didn't really bother me. So if you were to peek behind the Patricia Cornwell paperbacks, you would just find more Patricia Cornwell books. And so this is how I attack a used bookstore. I first do a quick scan of the spines to answer the question, are there books here for me at all? Or are the shelves just filled with James Patterson bestsellers? There were definitely a lot of vintage paperbacks among the contemporary bestsellers in this shop. So I asked Becky what her pricing structure was, and she said that every mass market paperback was $2, which I was happy to hear. She said trade paperbacks were more. I think it was $3. I wasn't paying that much attention. It wasn't my thing. So one thing I did, which ended up being smart before I left home, is I threw 2 boxes of books that I didn't want anymore into the trunk of my car. There was a handful of Detective Book Club triple books and probably like 40 Slocum adult Western paperbacks that were under the name of Jake Logan was the house name for those. I didn't want the Slocums anymore, and there's really no secondary market for them near where we live. And even selling sizable lots of Slocum books on eBay isn't going to get you more than about 75 cents per copy. So I asked Becky how trades worked at her store, and she said that trade credits can be used for half the value of a book, or in my case, it would bring my cash price down to $1 per book. Meanwhile, I get to unload a box of used books that was really of no value to me. And as we talked in the past, whenever possible, you should treat your used books that you don't want as currency to buy books that you do want. So Becky counted up my books. There were about 45 of them and told me that I now had $45 credit in her store. I didn't expect to ever be back in Chiefland, and so I knew that I could buy 45 books there for $45, and that's a really nice price. I like that. So anyway, back to the books in her shop. I found a Marvin Albert book in his late career Stone Angel series. I got the John D. MacDonald standalone You Live Twice, the 1980s paperback of Butcher's Moon by Donald Westlake writing as Richard Stark, and a bunch of very early Nick Carter Killmaster paperbacks. I got some of the Quiller espionage books by Adam Hall, and a really beautiful, I don't know if you have this, let me show you this. Do you have this? Dan J. Marlowe paperback titled Never Live Twice.
I don't have that.
You don't have that. I'll throw it here. If you want to borrow it, you can. I like him, but you're also way into him as well. You'll probably get to it before I will. I got a Lou Cameron war novel called The First Blood, no relation to First Blood. I got Nazi Hunter #2 by Mark Mandel. I got a couple plantation novels, a bunch of vintage horror paperbacks, and maybe a dozen vintage westerns from authors including Frank Gruber and Jack Bickham. Anyway, I was texting you photos as I was shopping to drive you into a jealous rage, and you saw a book you wanted, so I grabbed it for you. It's called Sea Siege by Andre Norton. Let me throw that to you. Andre Norton, I made a mistake a few episodes ago and referred to him as a dude when, in fact, she is a woman. She's a highly regarded female author named Andre Alice Norton. What is it about Sea Siege that caught your eye from afar, Eric?
So you sent me about 5 photos of the store selection when you were there, and I don't know if you remember this, but you sent me one photo that just was a stack of Richard Blade books, and I didn't really care about those that much. But I was looking right below that, and there's like 4 slimmer books in that picture right below that stack. So I zeroed in on the thinnest book to know if it was of the era that I was looking for. And Sea Siege just sounded awesome, and I really liked the spine, so I quickly checked the synopsis online while you were there shopping. And I discovered that it's a post-apocalyptic novel from 1957. And you know how much I love those.
Yeah, definitely.
So you kindly snagged it for me, just like you always do on your book shopping adventures. You know, I feel like I get to shop as well, so I'm always jacked up when you're going shopping somewhere in the nation.
Because I'm a man on the road and you're agoraphobic.
I'm stuck in my house, but I can throw 1 or 2 titles into your shopping cart, normally based on the pictures you sent me, which is really nice. So I appreciate that.
No, it's my way of paying to be on your show. So you also noticed something interesting about one of the 45 books that I bought. This one's called Prison of Ice by David Axton. It's a Fawcett Crest paperback from 1956, and it promises to be a super suspense adventure in the tradition of Alistair MacLean. The plot synopsis says that a worldwide drought threatens Earth, and the only solution is to melt ice from the Arctic. So a special squad of Arctic scientists plants 60 powerful bombs under the ice. I can tell there's already a bad idea. Before the scientists can flee safely, an earthquake hits and breaks off an iceberg with the scientists on it, drifting out to sea with bombs chained to the iceberg under the water. Even better, one member of the team is a homicidal maniac.
Of course.
So the book's called Prison of Ice by David Axton. Now, Eric, you have an eagle eye, so tell the listeners what you know about this book and this author.
So the real author of the book in your hand is none other than Dean R. Koontz. And as you said, it was published under the David Axton pseudonym in 1976. But then Kuntz revised the book, and he re-released it, I believe, in 1995. And he put his own name on it at that point, and he retitled it also. It's called Icebound.
Have you read either version?
No, and I don't know why. You know, I read mostly all of his stuff that was coming out in the 1990s, and somehow I missed that one. But, you know, I was looking back in my defense. I don't believe Icebound came out as a hardback in America. I think it did in overseas, and I think I would have seen it at Kmart or wherever I was shopping back then for books if it was a new release like, Cold Fire or Hideaway, which came out in hardback at that time.
Do you know the extent of the edits he made? Like if I read Prison of Ice and Icebound back to back, will I notice much of a difference?
I'm not sure on that. And I tried searching online to see if there were any specifics listed, but I came up with nothing. But I did discover this, Tom. I discovered that Kuntz sold Prison of Ice with 6 other 1970s books that were written under his name or pseudonym for $10 million
oh my God.
to Ballantine in the 1990s. So he probably made, what do you think, $1,500 to $2,000 for that book?
Yeah.
And he essentially sold it for, $1 million. So
it's a nice payday.
Yeah.
So I got another early Kuntz thriller called Dragonfly that he wrote under the pseudonym of K.R. Dwyer that I want to read. I'm sure there's others out there as well.
So when you left the store, did you leave any books behind that I can, snag, go that way?
No, I left a ton of good stuff behind. I didn't really buy I didn't buy the complete set of the Richard Blade series that you saw there by Jeffrey Lohr, because I already have those. I barely touched the men's adventure section, which had a ton of books in like the SOB series, The Executioner, the Matt Helm. There's Hammond Innes books remaining, a few Death Merchant books. There was at least one Ralph Hayes Check Force book I left behind. The vintage horror and Western sections were both awesome and mostly intact. I only got a couple things from there. As I was paying for my paperbacks, I asked Becky what her story was, because it just seemed like an unlikely place for a bookstore. And she said that she's from upstate New York and that her father was a real big reader. And I guess their basement in New York was just filled with boxes of paperbacks. So at some point, the family moves down to Chiefland, and they're living in a double-wide trailer. And this poses a problem for Dad because there's no longer a basement to store his boxes and boxes of books. So Dad begins selling books from his collection at the local flea market. And he began doing rather well as a bookstore there. And so in 2012, Dad opened the Never Ending Story bookstore in its current location, and now it's Becky's business to run. So I tell her about Paperback Warrior, and she said that she'll listen, and if she does, it will double our female listenership. I also asked her if she is sitting on a warehouse of old paperbacks somewhere, because all these used booksellers are, as you and I know. And she said yes, that she has boxes of books in storage, but she couldn't promise me that they were the vintage stuff we liked. I gave her my business card and said, listen, if you find out that you're sitting on a bunch of old stuff, let me know, and my broadcast partner and I will come down and make an offer for them. Would you be up for that kind of road trip?
Yeah, definitely. We can check out the quilting museum while we're there.
Yeah, there you go.
And you really sold me on the description of a blanket made from, who was it? Gerald Ford's neckties.
Yeah, see, there you go. I would also say that Becky was thrilled to be getting rid of 45 old books from her shelves because she said none of her customers ever want these old books that you and I have an entire show about. Anyway, so listener, if you ever find yourself in Central Florida, maybe visiting a family member in prison or something, stop by Never Ending Story used books in Chiefland and tell Becky that the Paperback Warrior guys said hello. So you ready for a feature?
Let's do it.
Play me a song first, Eric. Our feature today is on a sleaze fiction author named Orrie Hitt. Now, I hate to call the guy a sleaze fiction author because his books are so much better than that. But they were most definitely marketed as sex novels, and they were nearly all published by sleaze fiction publishing houses. But let's go back to the beginning. Orrie Edwin Hitt was born in Colchester, New York in 1916. When he was 11 years old, his father committed suicide. Now, Orrie got a job at a hunting lodge in upstate New York to make ends meet while his mom worked as a hotel chambermaid. At the hunting lodge, Orrie made 25 cents per hour, which probably saved he and his mother's lives during the Great Depression because they were finally able to get, food and shelter and stuff. Meanwhile, Orrie was going to high school. As a sophomore, he told his teacher that he wanted to be a writer, and his teacher did what all good teachers do. she shattered his dreams by telling him he will never make it as a writer because his English language skills sucked and he was too much of a dreamer. You know, having that kind of creative mind, Eric, is really bad for you when you want to be a writer. So while he was working at the lodge, he got to know a little bit about hunting and outdoorsmanship, and he sold his first articles about hunting as a high schooler to hobbyist magazines. And when he became a senior, both he and that former English teacher both submitted articles to an educational book company. Orrie's article was about riflery and was accepted and published by that educational book company, and his teacher's submission was rejected.
Imagine that.
Yeah, so time wounds all heals, right? Yeah. So teenage Orrie is working at the hunt club where his aunt, which is his mother's sister, has a house on the property. Now, this is upstate New York, and they have these wicked snowstorms there. And during one storm at his aunt's house, Orrie's mom keels over and dies. Orrie carries his mom's dead body to the family car and drives her to town to get medical attention, but by the time he arrived, it was too late. Orrie became an orphan. I know, sad. So during World War II, he joins the Army at age 24. I don't have much info about what his service time looked like. I know he went in as a private and left as a first lieutenant. So I guess he must have done something right, but I don't really understand all the military ranks to know if that's something remarkable or just the normal way it works. Anyway, he married a woman named Charlotte Tucker on Valentine's Day in 1943, and together they eventually had 4 daughters. In the years following the war, Orrie worked as an insurance salesman, a radio disc jockey, a roofing and tile salesman, a frozen food salesman, and a handyman. He had about 16 jobs during that post-war period, and he wasn't writing much because he needed the steady paycheck to feed his wife and growing family of daughters. So during that time, he relocated to Iceland, actually, for a year to work at a hotel.
Did you say Iceland?
Iceland, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
wow.
So it's kind of a random thing.
Yeah.
So he goes to Iceland for a year, and his job as at the hotel, I'm not clear if his family came with him or if it was one of those things where he went and made some money and sent it home. That was not clear to me. But his job had a lot of downtime, and he used that downtime to write his first novel. You see, by that point, 1950 had rolled around, and 25-cent original paperback books were this hot new entertainment medium for the average Joe who saved the world fighting the Japanese and Nazis a decade earlier. So Orrie Hitt, who always had a knack for writing and was trying to scrape together a living in Iceland, of all places, tries his hand at writing his first novel at age 34. Now, it's clear to me that Orrie was a fan of James M. Cain, and a lot of Orrie's books ended up being reworkings of Cain's Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice. The plot is basically the drifter falls in love with a married woman, and they conspire to kill her heel of a husband so the guy can get the girl and the husband's money. Of course, things go sideways, as they do anytime you fall in love with a murderous wife. And that's basically the template from a lot of writers in the 1950s. And Orrie went to that well many, many times in his own writing. Anyway, so his first published novel was called I'll Call Every Monday from 1953. It was about a door-to-door salesman who falls for a housewife, and they plot to kill her husband. I heard it's a great book, and it remains available from Prologue Press. The original book was published as a hardcover and then a 25-cent paperback by Avon, which was a respectable publishing house at the time, and it really launched Orrie's career as a novelist. Now, a new reader to Orrie Hitt is going to notice 2 things. One, that lust and sex are huge motivators for the book's protagonists. But the books are never really graphic in their sex scenes. And 2, and this is what's interesting to me, and I really like his books probably for this reason, the books go into a tremendous amount of detail about the main character's job. Like, if he writes a book about a door-to-door insurance salesman, you walk away from that book feeling like you know that industry. Like, back in those days, the guy who sold you the policy would come to your house every week to pick up your premiums. And that was the premise behind the title of the book, I'll Call Every Monday. But it's not just door-to-door salespeople. When he wrote a book about a TV repairman, you really understood what it's like to be a TV repairman. It's clear that Orrie, he had worked a lot of jobs, but he also took the time to research those jobs for his paperbacks. Another thing to know about Orrie is that he was only 5 feet 5 inches tall. Actually, he could never find pants to fit his inseam, so his wife had to hem his pants for him. Something else about him is that his books, it's very important that to the author that the reader knows the height of his male protagonists. and that guy is always like 6'2". So as a guy who was always probably rather self-conscious about being 5'5", it's clear that this was a way for him to step into the shoes of a tall, broad-shouldered dude.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I guess. I'm psychoanalyzing this guy. So Orrie returns to upstate New York after his Iceland gig and sets his mind on being a novelist. He sets up his manual Remington Royal typewriter on the kitchen table, and he works all day, every day, cranking out 90 words a minute on his typewriter. He basically lived on iced coffee and Winston cigarettes while he wrote book after book after book. He was a faithful husband, a very attentive father, and every day, all day, he wrote about guys who were duplicitous heels who couldn't keep it in their pants. In real life, Orrie was nothing like the characters he wrote about in his books. Now, early in his career, Orrie developed business relationships with adults-only publishers like Beacon and Midwood, who bought and published his books. Orrie was doing this thing, and he found a good niche for himself as a writer of sexy fiction, often sexy crime fiction, but his publishers always played up the sex and down the crime. This guy is just trying to make a living, so he just keeps writing books that he knows how to write and getting advances between $250 to $1,000 per book for his paperbacks. So his sleaze publishers gave him a lot of freedom to write what he wanted because they knew all they're going to do, no matter what the book's about, is slap whatever silly sleaze cover they want on the books. Now, during his heyday, Orrie was actually making a good living. He had a nice house, a new car, put his daughters through college. Between the years of 1953 and 1970, Orrie Hitt had about 150 original novels published under his own name and a variety of pseudonyms. There's a robust collector's market for sleaze fiction, and his original paperbacks tend to get top dollar. Now, my recommendation is to hit the reprint houses. Stark House, Prologue Press, and Automat Press have also reprinted a ton of Orrie Hitt books, and they tend to be the best of his work. These reprint houses will do the work for you on figuring out what his best books are. So what I want to do now, Eric, is just go through some of his books so the listener can know where to start. I read a great essay that broke down a lot of his work by themes. For example, if you want a James M. Cain style novel about the protagonist falling for a woman married to an older rich guy, you go with Cheaters, Dial M for Man, or Two of a Kind. Now, if you want a book about a young woman trying to survive in the modern world with nothing but her body to pay the bills as a model or a hooker, you go with Campus Tramp, Four Women, or Trapped. If you want a novel that exposes the behind-the-scenes look at the world of prostitutes and their tragic origin stories, there's a lot of those. You can go with Trailer Tramp, Nude Doll, Naked Model, Girls of the Streets, Call South 3300, Ask for Molly, Party Doll.
Can you imagine that he's sitting at the kitchen table typing and he's writing all these stories, and he's probably doing this as his, this is obviously his day job. Wife comes home at 5, kids come home from school, and he's in the middle of Nude Doll. I mean,
that's the irony of Orrie Hitt. He's this suburban family man, and making breakfast for his kids, and how was your day at school, honey? And he's just typing and typing and typing these like sleazy novels. For a pretty comprehensive index of his plot themes, you should check out the Stark House double of Dial M for Man and the Cheaters. There's an afterword by a guy named Michael Hemminson. That's everything you need to know. And I think Brian Ritt did the introduction, which is also really informative. So I've read 3 Orrie Hitt novels, and I intend to read more. The first one was Dial M for Man, and I'll review that at the end of the show. The next one I can personally recommend is called The Cheaters. It's about this broke protagonist who lands a job at a bar that has 3 prostitutes working the bar. There's a crooked cop who shakes down the hookers for protection money. Meanwhile, he falls in love with his boss's sexy wife, and they make plans to run away together. The book was absolutely great. Now, it's packaged with this romantic cover originally, but there's some truly shocking scenes of violence. You should definitely read this book. It's like I said before, it's a double that you can get right now by Stark House, along with Dial M for Man, which was also excellent. I'll review that later. And again, that book's called The Cheaters from 1960 by Orrie Hitt. I also want to endorse his 1959 novel, The Widow, that I reviewed on episode 21 of the show. Also been re-released by Stark House. It's about a guy working in a cabin motel for a mean old lady. He falls for her daughter-in-law, and they plot to kill the old bag to get her nest egg. It reminded me of an early Lawrence Block book, and it's an easy recommendation. Again, that book's called The Widow by Orrie Hitt. He used several pseudonyms during his career, including Kay Adams, Joe Black, Charles Verne, and Nicky Weaver. Between 1953 and 1960, Orrie Hitt was cranking out about 20 books per year. And then his productivity began to slow down. By 1964, he was down to about 4 books a year, and then 3, and then 1. It was sort of like he just burned out and ran out of ideas. Toward the end, his ideas ran out, and then the book contracts also disappeared, and his money ran out. He had a lifetime of working 12-hour days at his kitchen table, drinking iced coffee and smoking cigarettes, and that caught up with him, and he died in debt in a veterans hospital at age 59 in 1975. Now, his daughters have been interviewed, and they're very proud of their dad. When they were young, Orrie went to great pains to ensure that his books were never sold in his hometown because he never wanted to embarrass his daughters with what his dad, what the dad did for a living. He sounded like a really great guy. I wish I knew this guy. I mean, we live in a pretty kind of benign suburb, and it'd be so cool to know that the guy next door was doing that for a living.
Yeah.
So a bunch of his books have been reprinted. If you search the name Orrie Hitt on Amazon, you won't have to spend a fortune to sample his work. So I guess that's my Orrie Hitt feature. Again, I really like the guy, and he just seemed like a really cool dude. So Eric, why don't you do your review, and then we'll circle back and do mine.
All right, that sounds good. So I've been on an Edward S. Aarons kick lately, and I just reviewed his early paperback called The Net on the blog. I've also covered one other one called Terror in the Town. And I know you've concentrated on Aaron's assignment series, and you enjoyed those. That series, which stars CIA agent Sam Durrell, was really Aaron's moneymaker, and he authored 42 of those. Most people think that Aaron's had just that one series character, but Tom, piggybacking off of your podcast feature a couple weeks ago, I found that Aaron's actually had another series character, or what you call a hidden series character.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that character's name is Jerry Benedict. Now, Benedict doesn't seem like the focal point of a busy crime noir novel. You see, Benedict is a political cartoonist for New York's Globe magazine. His boss is a guy named Lucius McConaughey. Now, both of these characters appeared first in a 1947 novel called No Place to Live, which was also published under the name Lady, the Guy is Dead. In that book, Benedict stumbles upon a corpse, and the narrative moves like a smooth murder mystery with Benedict playing the newshound / amateur detective. So for this 1948 novel, Gift of Death, the premise has Benedict back in the role as the hero, attempting to solve a murder mystery. And so here's how it shakes out. Benedict's boss, McConaughey, wants the two of them to venture south from New York City to this rural stretch of Connecticut farmland. And the reason is because McConaughey's uncle has recently died, and the estate's paying out a whopping $600,000 to McConaughey and his 5 cousins. The kicker is that it must be split up 6 ways. So also McConaughey has just learned that one of the cousins, and her name is, I got it written down here, her name is Amanda, barely missed being decapitated. Her secretary was mistakenly killed off, and the intended target was probably Amanda. So McConaughey wants Benedict to accompany him so they can A, keep McConaughey himself alive, and then B, determine which family member is attempting to kill off all the remaining heirs. In Aaron's narrative, surprisingly, his narrative includes a weird menace subplot, which takes place at the family farm. The old house is rumored to be haunted. A double suicide occurred there in one bedroom. And there's this massive tree that was used for hanging in the early 1800s. So kind of spooky stuff. But what I love about Aaron's is his descriptive detail on location, setting, and atmosphere. Those 3 things are everything to Aaron's for these standalones. So like books like The Net and Terror in the Town, he used a tiny northeastern fishing village with all the, the ghost-like things you'd find there, lighthouses, old abandoned ships. He does the same sort of thing here, but he adds in things like dark cornfields or a hilltop cemetery. There's the old dark plantation house. There's empty summer cottages. He's a really talented storyteller, and he uses those descriptive setting and locations to really build the story. If you like an old-fashioned, dense murder mystery, I think Gift of Death will entertain you. Despite the spooky ambience, I found the characters to be just a little shallow, and I thought they were stereotypical, which sort of, I don't know, it kind of undermined the core mystery to the whole thing. But Benedict plays the proverbial 1940s detective, and, he's interviewing all the parties, and he's drinking alcohol, and I got really invested in the killer's identity, and I thought the narrative's momentum was just right. It had a good pace to it. So that being said, I recommend Gift of Death by Edward S. Aarons to the murder mystery fans out there.
All right, good. I think we're overdue for an Aaron's episode coming up. It's probably the next month, a couple months.
Yeah, let me read a dozen more.
Yeah, we got to do that. So I'll make this quick. Dial M for Man by Orrie Hitt is my review of the night, my feature review. It's a 1962 release, reprinted by Starkhouse. It's like I said earlier, it's a double packaged along with Hitt's The Cheaters. It stars a guy named Hob Sampson, who's a TV repairman, and he's called out to a repair job, and the lady of the house is named Doris, and she's a real dish. Her way older husband, Mr. Condon, is a crooked local businessman. Now, Sampson isn't immediately able to give her the tube she needs, Eric, so he agrees to come back later to take care of her while Mr. Condon is out of town. There's a lot of interpersonal stuff between Sampson and his virginal quasi-girlfriend and his deadbeat buddy that rounds the story out and gives Sampson the motivation to have Doris for himself. Now, Eric, does the story of a TV repairman plotting to kill a rich guy for his money and sexy wife sound familiar?
Yes, Vengeful Virgin by Gil Brewer, which was reprinted by Hard Case Crime.
Right, so it's the exact same plot. It's also the Vengeful Virgin from 4 years earlier is basically the same plot as this. In all fairness, though, Brewer's novel was just a reworking of James M. Cain's Double Indemnity, and while the femme fatale story structure has been copied countless times since, Hitt's story, he makes the story his own, but he probably should have made the narrator a plumber or a Wi-Fi installer or something like that to hide the fact that he was basically borrowing the TV repairman plot. Anyway, as often is the case with Orrie Hitt novels, the reader learns a lot about the main character's chosen profession. I find it fascinating, and I feel like I now have a master's degree in TV retailing, reception, and repair. In 1962, Orrie Hitt predicted that cable TV will be the future of America. However, he did not foresee Netflix streaming. Dial M for Man was a total blast to read. The first-person narration from Sampson really gave the reader a palpable sense of the lust and greed that makes an otherwise honorable man make some very deadly and bad decisions. And the ending to the book was just pitch perfect. So with that, why don't you wrap us up?
All right, that concludes another exciting episode of the Paperback Warrior podcast. We hope you loved it. Join us next Monday. We're going to have an all-new action-packed show. And again, check us out every day at paperbackwarrior.com for reviews and features. Also follow us on Facebook, where we tease you with all these fantastic covers and the books that we discuss here on the show. On behalf of Tom, this is Eric saying so long.